History. Very good. First book of the history.
Joshua, Joseph, Ruth, First and Second Samuel, First, Second Kings,
First and Second Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah,
Nehemiah,
and Esther.
All right, what's the next section?
Wisdom,
Very good.
Jude, Psalms, Proverbs,
Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon,
Yep. All right, what's the next section?
Minor Prophets,
You close.
Major.
Major.
Major. Very good.
I was wondering, a little one.
All right, what's the first book of Major Prophets?
Isaiah,
Jeremiah,
Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel.
Very good. All right, so we are continuing in the book of Daniel. We talked about last week, Daniel is the author of this. The first 6 chapters of Daniel are primarily like narrative and history. How we would read history, it's written in that way. It's a recorded history for Daniel. And so that's the first part of the book of Daniel. Now, the second part of Daniel is entirely made up of visions, dreams, and interpretations of things. And, I just want to make something clear. I don't know everything, all details about everything that's being said here. There are so many different interpretations from people who are a lot smarter than I am about these last few chapters. I'm not going to pretend that I know it all, because I don't. I am going to try and give you somewhat of an overview, so that way you'll get some kind of understanding about some of it. Now, there are some implications here. I don't think anybody really knows what it's talking about. But we'll do the best we can today. And we're going to go through this maybe a little bit in more detail, just because it's kind of hard just to do an overview. Because if I did an overview, I could say, well, Daniel sees future kingdoms that are going to come that we know in history. He gets a vision of a future world ruler. He gets a vision of these beasts and the interpretation of them, and tells us a little bit about the end times, the end. That's how I could summarize it, because that's basically what it is. But that doesn't help you, so we're going to go through this a little bit more detail than we normally do, just for that fact. Now, as we begin in chapter 7, Daniel, he gives us clues and details as far as what's going on. And this first detail he gives us is he gives us the setting. And that's what he generally does. So Daniel's not veering too far from where he generally starts out. But he tells us when he had this vision. And he says, in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and visions of his head as he lay in his bed. Then he wrote down the dream and told the sum of the matter. And so he's telling us that he's given us a time frame in which he had this vision. Now, keep in mind, this is the first time that Daniel is actually given a vision instead of just interpreting one. Because before, the king had the vision, and the first time, remember, Daniel, he went and he and his friends, they went and they prayed to God, and they asked God to show them what the king dreamed. And so God did that and gave him the interpretation. Then the next time the king had the dream, he told Daniel the dream this time, and then God showed Daniel the interpretation. So this time, the vision was given directly to Daniel. Now, this vision was given in the first year of Belshazzar. And that's the same Belshazzar that we meet in chapter 5. Now, chapter 5, we get a brief glimpse of Belshazzar. Remember, he's the one who brought out the vessels that had come from the temple in Jerusalem, and they drank out of them. They're having this big party. And remember the handwriting on the wall. And Daniel came in and gave that account. And we have only a glimpse of Belshazzar in those last moments, because it said that night, that very night, they came in and took over the Babylonian kingdom. So Belshazzar was a co-regent of another king. So he was allowed to be able to rule that area. But this is the same Belshazzar that we see in Daniel chapter 5. So this actually takes place earlier than chapter 5. So I guess as you can tell, this part of Daniel is not in chronological order if you read it from chapter 1. So it's actually going backwards a little bit. All right, so as he's talking about this, he starts talking about what he sees. Now, in verses 2 and 3, he talks about seeing. He says, Daniel declared, and I saw in my vision by night, behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. And four great beasts come up out of the sea, different from one another. All right, so immediately we know that Daniel, you got to pay attention to the details in these matters, because Daniel says he was given a vision. All right, have you ever had a dream? It's a vision. All right, have you ever dreamed something really weird? Yes. All right, so, but God gave Daniel this vision and allowed him to see something. Now, Daniel's trying to describe it. Now, I know that I've had dreams that are pretty hard to describe. And so I imagine Daniel seeing something like this would be pretty hard to describe. But here we have, through the Holy Spirit's inspiration, this interpretation. Now, Daniel tells us first what he sees, but then later we get the interpretation. So let's go through that. But before we do that, one thing we got to say, he says he saw the great sea stirred up. Now, what's the sea talking about? Because this is important. You think it's the literal sea?
The world.
Well, he actually tells us. Because it says that the four beasts arise out of the sea. Now, in that part of the world, what's the closest body of water other than the Sea of Galilee or the Dead Sea?
Mediterranean.
The Mediterranean. Now, there's a lot of commentators who say that that is what the sea is talking about, that Daniel has a vision of the sea of the Mediterranean. Now, Daniel's in Babylon, so I don't know that this is referring to that, but well, I know he's not referring to that because Daniel gives us the answer. So I want you to look, before we go through the next verses, skip over to verse 17. Look at what verse 17 says. Verse 17 says, these four great beasts are four kings who shall arise out of the earth. Not out of the water, out of the earth. So here, in verse 17, that gives us the interpretation of what sea means. Alright, so those things are important. Pay attention to details. So these are going to be four kings who rise up out of the earth. Now he goes on and he starts describing these different things. The first one said it was like a lion that had eagle's wings. He says he looked and the wings were plucked off and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and the mind of man was given to it. Alright, so Daniel's going to tell us what that is later, so I'm not going to go through that. The next one he talks about seeing. He said it was a bear, raised up on one side, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth, and it was told, arise, devour much flesh. And then another one came, and this one looked like a leopard, with 4 wings of a bird on his back, and the beast had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. And he said, and then after this, in the night visions, he saw a 4th beast, terrifying and dreadful, exceedingly strong, had great iron teeth, it devoured broken pieces, and stamped what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. Now those, when we get to Revelation, you got the 10-horn beast in Revelation, so Daniel and Revelation, they go together. So anytime, I always say, anytime you study Revelation, you need to have Daniel open too. And so, it tends to make a little bit more sense. But he sees this 4th beast, and it was terrifying. He said, in verse 8, I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another horn, a little one, before which 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the Son of Man, and a mouth speaking great things. Alright, so there's a lot of things that Daniel sees there. At the time, there were some aspects of this that were probably harder to interpret, but some of it wasn't, because Daniel is given the interpretation of what he sees. Now, in the break of the interpretation, Daniel sees something else. He has another vision. And then this time, in verse 9, he says, as I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames, its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him. 1,000,000 served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The courts sat in judgment, and the books were opened. Alright, so he sees something that is similar to what Ezekiel saw. Remember, Ezekiel saw a throne, he saw an image, he saw the chariot with the wheels. Now maybe this is a reference to that as well. But remember, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel all had visions. Alright, so Daniel is given a vision of the throne room, the Ancient of Days. That's talking about God. I think it means the everlasting one. Alright, so he sees the Ancient of Days. So he sees a vision of God. Now he didn't actually see God, because no man can see God. Alright, so he was given a vision, which is different. Alright, so he was given this vision of God. And then he said, and I looked because of the sound of the great words that the horn was speaking. And as I looked, the beast was killed, and his body destroyed, and given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. Now, to understand more of that, you've got to read on in the chapter, because once you read on in the chapter, it makes it apparent who this is, and also makes it apparent that this last part here is well into the future, because it ain't happened yet. The next thing that we see, he sees another vision. Verse 13, he said, I saw in the night visions, behold, the clouds of heaven. There came one like the Son of Man. And he came to the Ancient of Days, and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. So obviously, we know who this is talking about. This is talking about Jesus Christ. And we know that that has not happened yet either. So we know that this is well into the future.
A lot of prophecy.
A lot of prophecy. But see, in that moment, Daniel's seeing these visions, but he's also given a piece of hope, because he sees God and then he sees Jesus, and they both in the end win. See, it tells us that Daniel has a hard time with these visions. It hurts him, it terrifies him. He doesn't know what to do with them. And you can imagine that if you saw something like that, God speaking to you and God, being with you like that, and He's showing you these visions, I expect it would bother us too.
Well, it's just like you said, it's just like John in Revelations. Exactly.
Exactly. So, Daniel sees all this. Now, we get this like little intermission, then we see an interpretation. And so here's where we get into this interpretation. He said in verse 15, "As for me, Daniel." Now this tells us this is coming from first person, from his point of view. Said, "My spirit within me was anxious, and the visions of my head alarmed me. I approached one of those who stood there and asked him the truth concerning all this. So he told me and made known to me the interpretation of the things." So in his vision, there's somebody there that he can ask about this. All right, so we know that he's not there by himself in this vision. He's having a conversation with someone. And he said, in verse 17, said, "These four great beasts are four kings who shall arise out of the earth, but the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, forever, and ever." All right, so right there he says, basically he's saying, despite what I'm getting ready to tell you, the saints will prevail, and they will be in the kingdom forever and ever and ever. Now remember, Isaiah came along and prophesied many great things about this future kingdom that was going to come. Jeremiah prophesied about a future kingdom that would come. Ezekiel prophesied about a future kingdom that would come. So I'm sure that Daniel knew of these prophecies. He knew of these people. So I'm sure that he probably understood more than maybe we think he did, but he did understand these things. But he's given a word of hope. Now, in verse 19, Daniel skips over the other three. He said, "I desired to know the truth about the fourth beast, which was different from all the rest, exceedingly terrifying, with its teeth of iron and claws of bronze, which devoured and broke into pieces and stamped what was left with its feet." So let's look at these kingdoms. All right, now he skipped over them, but let's look at the first beast that he saw, a lion with wings. Now we've already talked about this. In Babylon, it's been discovered through archaeology that they have found, like at the gates, entrances of gates, they've got lions with wings on them. So this was a representation of the kingdom of Babylon. So if you go back to Daniel chapter 2, when Daniel interpreted the dream for King Neb, what did he see? He saw this big statue with a head of gold, chest of silver, thighs of bronze, legs of iron, feet partly of iron and clay. All right, so chapter 2 corresponds with what he saw in chapter 7. It's just, one commentator said that the two different visions, Daniel chapter 2 come from a vision from a man point of view, from an earthly perspective of kingdoms. But this vision come from a different point of view. This one came from a heavenly point of view. And so here we see this kingdom, Babylon, represented by something that we know that they had there in their kingdom. The next kingdom that we saw, it said that the two wings were plucked off, and there was another kingdom came in, and said it was a bear with 3 ribs in its mouth. And now, the bear here represents the Medo-Persian Empire, and some commentators suggest that the 3 ribs, Medo-Persia captured 3 major nations as they were capturing Babylon, and I can't remember which 3 they were, but they said that was representative of the bear and the 3 ribs. And then it said, then came along one like a leopard. This leopard said it had wings. Let's see, let me read it just so I make sure I get it right. It said it had, with 4 wings like a bird on its back, and the beast had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. All right, so we know that the next kingdom that came after Medo-Persia was the Grecian Empire, and we do know that after Alexander the Great, he had 4 generals that were given land in the Greece Empire. So we'll talk about that in a minute in chapter 8, because it comes back to that. And then he sees this 4th beast. And the 4th beast is Rome. There are some people who disagree with what these interpretations are, but for a very long time, this has been the general consensus, because Babylon, the Medo-Persian Empire, Greece, and Rome have been the 4 major world empires at that time. So to me, it's kind of hard to argue with us having that historical information, because as Daniel describes it, each kingdom was greater than the other. And we know that each kingdom, as history records it, as we learn more through archaeology, we know that that's true. We know that they completely come in and conquered these people and took over their kingdoms, and each kingdom grew bigger and bigger across the world stage. And there's never been another territory as widespread as the Roman Empire, or as great as the Roman Empire. Now, there's been empires that's come along, but not like that. So I think, just based on history and what we see here, I think we're pretty sure that this is talking about these 4 kingdoms. Now, as I go back to this, he says he saw this. He wanted to know more about the 4th beast, because this one was a lot different than the other one. He said it was a lot more terrifying than the other ones. Now, think about it. Now, I could see where Daniel could get by seeing a lion with 2 wings. He saw that in Babylon probably every day. As far as the bear, he's probably seen bears before. A leopard, I'm pretty sure he's probably seen a leopard, not with 4 wings, I would say, and 4 heads, but he's seen a leopard. But this other one was a beast with 10 horns, and he doesn't describe what the beast is. He just said it was terrifying. He said it was a beast with 10 horns. He said with its teeth of iron. Now the other stuff, the other beast, even though it was, not realistic, it was still using realistic things. Because wings are realistic, heads are realistic, those things are real. But how many animals do you know that have teeth of iron? I don't know any. All right, so that one definitely would have been something a lot different than what Daniel could have ever imagined. Not only that, it had teeth of iron, claws of bronze, and said it devoured and broke into pieces and stamped out what was left with its feet. So he's just reiterating what he had already said previously about what he saw. He said about the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn that came up, and before with which 3 of them fell, the horn that had eyes and the mouth that spoke great things, and that seemed greater than its companies. As I looked, this horn made war with the saints and prevailed over them, until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was given for the saints of the Most High, and the time came when the saints possessed the kingdom. Now obviously here, we know that, in part, this 4th kingdom, we know it was Rome, and we know how great they were, But then he goes on and he talks about this little horn that popped up. And again, we're going to talk about this again in chapter 8. But he talks about this little horn. He said it speaks like a man, it has eyes like a man. So I think we can fairly say that it's probably a man. He said it makes war with the saints. He said, but it's not over until the Ancient of Days comes. And judgment is poured out. And it said, and the saints possess the kingdom. Now, has that happened yet? That has not happened yet, because the saints have not possessed the kingdom, because the Ancient of Days has not come out and poured out that judgment. That is coming, but it has not happened yet. So there's a little, that double predictive prophecy that I've talked about, where it can talk about certain parts of prophecy will come true, and then there's another part that may come later. We'll see that again in chapter 8. In verse 23, he says, thus he said, as for the fourth beast, there shall be a fourth kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all the kingdoms, and it shall devour the whole earth, and trample it down, and break it to pieces. Now as for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings shall arise, and another shall arise after them. He shall be different from the former ones, and he shall put down 3 kings. He shall speak words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and shall think to change the times and the law, and they shall be given into his hand, for a time, times, and half a time. But the court shall sit in judgment, and his dominion shall be taken away, to be consumed and destroyed to the end. And the kingdom and dominion, and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High. His kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. So obviously, again, when he goes back to this little horn, he speaks of him as a singular person who makes war against the saints, and that he will be destroyed, and that the servants of the Most High God will possess that kingdom. Again, we know that has not happened yet. Now, there's a lot, talking about the 10 horned beast, there's a lot of people who've said, all right, these 10 kings, they've tried to relate it to the European Union when it got to 10 countries. And I think that happened I want to say in 1980. And so there was a lot of prophetic scholars who said that prophecy was being fulfilled in the 1980s with the 10-country pact of the European Union, the EU. And as that kind of went on for a few years, there were 2 more countries then added to that, so that kind of displaced the EU as being that 10 kingdom or 10 king kingdom. Now eventually the EU then became the United Nations, and the United Nations, they expanded, and there's over 20 countries that are involved with the United Nations. So people trying to equate that also kind of falling short, and that's the problem with sometimes trying to equate current events with biblical prophecy. Now, you might be able to take one part of it and try and make it fit, but the rest of it's got to fit too in there. And so as you read Bible prophecy and you see all the amazing things that take place, you got to say, well, there's a lot of that stuff that hadn't happened yet. So you got to say, well, this has got to be something in the future. So we don't know who the 10 kings are. We don't know who the 10 kingdoms are. We don't know what 3 they pluck up, and we certainly don't know who the Antichrist is. It's not Bill Clinton. It's not Obama. It's not Biden. It's not Trump. It's none of them. We don't know who it is. We know it'll be somebody, but it ain't them. we'll know when they come on the scene. But there's things that have got to happen. There's a lot of things that have got to happen. And we ain't seen none of it yet.
I think we'll be gone.
Well, that's not for certain.
I know it's not, so I think we'll be gone.
Well, that's wishful thinking, and I hope it comes true. I really do. There would be nothing better than to be taken out of here and not have to worry about it. But we better be prepared to be ready. That's the main thing. Now, in verse 28, Daniel says, after he sees this, he said, here's the end of the matter. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly alarmed me, and my color changed, but I kept the matter in my heart. So, you know, you've heard that expression that when somebody gets scared or something, they're as white as a ghost. I guess that's what happened to Daniel. It really tore him up, what he saw. And I imagine so. Now, as we get into chapter 8, Daniel has another vision. Here in verse 1 and 2, he gives us the general setting again. This time he says, it's in the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar. A vision appeared to me, Daniel, after that which appeared to me at the first. And I saw in the vision, and when I saw, I was in Susa, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in the vision, and I was at the Eula Canal. Now it tells us it was in the 3rd year of King Belshazzar, and that also that he was in the citadel in Susa. Now that was the capital of the Persian Empire. So Daniel's already is being given a vision of the next empire, because right now he's under the rule of the Babylonian Empire. The Medo-Persian Empire comes in and takes over Babylon, and their capital was in Susa. And so Daniel sees himself in the capital of the Persian kingdom. So God's already given him a vision of what's ahead. Now he has this vision. In verse 3, he said, I raised my eyes and saw, and behold, a ram standing on the bank of the canal. It had 2 horns, and both horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. He said, I saw the ram. He said, I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward. No beast could stand before him, and there was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. He said, verse 5, as I was considering, behold, a male goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came to the ram with the 2 horns which I had seen standing on the bank of the canal, and he ran at him in his powerful wrath. I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him and struck the ram and broke his 2 horns. And the ram had no power to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him, and there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. Then the goat became exceedingly great, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken. Instead of it, there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the winds of heaven, toward the 4 winds of heaven. Now he gives the interpretation of this later on. I'm going to go ahead and give it to you now so we can talk about the details. All right, this ram that he saw in verse 4, charging westward and northward and southward. He said, no beast could stand before him, and there was no one who could rescue him from power. He did as he pleased because he was great. All right, he said that one had 2 horns. He said both horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. All right. Here he's talking about the Medo-Persian Empire, because the Medes were a kingdom of their own at the first. The Persian Empire came in and basically subjugated the Median Empire, and they were known as the Medo-Persian Empire. So he's talking about two horns that grew, and he's talking about the latter horn grew up higher than the other. And so he's talking about the Medo-Persian Empire. That's the ram that he saw. Now we know that the Persian Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire, we know that they were great because they came in and they wiped out the Babylonian Empire and crushed it. Now after that he sees this goat. So the male goat came from the west. Alright, so think about a map, think about Babylon, or even you can even think about Israel at this point. It came from the west, so that means it came from that direction. So you got to think of Europe. It came somewhere from Europe. All right, so it came that way. It came from the west, which means it was moving eastward. And he said, it went across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. All right, so, a horn, typically in biblical prophecy, a horn means power. All right, and so here we have this power that's moving eastward. It said we know it's a male goat, and it's moving across the face of the earth, but it's not touching the ground. So that implies swiftness. He had this great horn, and he said he came to the ram with the two horns, and he destroyed that ram and trampled it under its feet, and said there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. So then the goat became exceedingly great. Now, the goat here, with the singular great horn who trampled the two-horned ram, that was Greece. Now, who was the great conqueror of Greece? Alexander the Great. Now, he conquered himself, he conquered with his army, he conquered a vast amount of land in the shortest amount of time than any world leader in history. He did it because he died when he was 33, I think. So he did this in just a hair over a decade. He conquered what was considered the Babylonian Empire that the Medo-Persian Empire had taken over, and he took over all of that and then some. So he did that in a little over a decade. Now some of these other places, it took them quite a long time to amass this power and this vastness of an empire. But he did it, so that tells you the implication of how fast he did it. He was a great leader, amplified by the big horn, and that nobody could do anything. He was a great conqueror. But then it says that he was exceedingly great, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. All right, so we can go back and look at history, and we know what this is talking about. Because at the height of Alexander's success, his huge empire, to him, he had conquered the world. And he suddenly died by some kind of disease. People say that he was a drunkard, and his lust and his drunkenness is what led to his demise. So he died at the greatness of his power. But he had 4 generals in which the kingdom went to. So as this great horn was broken, it was given to 4 of his kingdoms, which it says here that the 4 horns came up in its place. And so what are those? Well, here you can see that there's a great area. All of this was what was captured. Everything in red, all of that was captured by Alexander the Great in just over a decade. That's a lot of area. Because before, remember with Assyria, they had captured this up here. Babylon had captured around here. Well, when he came along, he had all this, even down into Africa, in just over a decade. So he was a great military leader.
He was wearing out horses, wasn't he?
Yeah, he knew what he was doing. And I was reading and it said that I don't know if it's true, if it's historical fact, I don't know, but I guess maybe legend or tradition says that before he became the great king that he was, right before that, there was a horse that nobody could conquer, nobody could ride, and he said, I'm gonna get on that horse. I'm gonna break that horse. And so, as history suggests, he broke that horse, and that was the horse that he rode into battle for the rest of his life. So, like I said, historically, I don't know if that's accurate, but it's kind of neat anyway, if that did happen. All right, but anyway, here, as you look, Cassander was one of his generals. He was given a big plot of land. It was divided. Antiochus was another one of his generals that was given land. Seleucus, and this was one of the greater of the generals. And then you had the Ptolemy Empire. Now, you might read somewhere of the Seleucid Empire in world history. And the Ptolemies, they came into play with Egypt. So the Seleucid Empire and the Ptolemaic Empire, they had influence going into the New Testament period. So these were great empires, but those were the four generals who were given power after Alexander died. So there's your four horns. Now let's go back. We stopped at verse 8, so let's go back to verse 9 here. Chapter 8. Now it said, out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. It grew great even to the host of heaven, and some of the host and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. It became great, even as great as the prince of the host. And the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. And a host will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offering because of transgression. And it will throw truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper. Now, this is one of those things that could be predictive prophecy because now, in the previous account, when Daniel was given a vision, he was given a vision of the four beasts of Rome, and then there was a little horn that came out of the 10 horns. All right? It doesn't say that here. There's something different here. He said out of those four, out of that kingdom, there came up a horn. All right? So I think we've got to pay attention to that. Now, what he says here is he's talking about a great leader who come in, who sounded like he hated God's people, and he was just a real, what we call a villain. Now, there is somebody in Greek history who would fit that profile, perfectly. Because he profaned, this would have been, by the time he come around, they would have already built the temple back after the exile, and they came back, they built the walls, they built the temple, and under Greek pressure, under this particular leader, he was specifically very, very harsh on the Jews. He slaughtered some over 80,000 of them, and he sold another 40,000 into slavery. So he was not a good guy. He was not the type of leader that really liked the Jews at all. He was a very malicious person, and now we do have historical records of how he acted, and he was very cruel. There's one account where there were two women. I forgot what the circumstance was, but there was two women, and he killed their children and hung their children around their necks and made them walk through public up to the highest wall and then threw them off. Sounds like a nice guy, doesn't it? But he also, most commentators tend to believe that the vision of this horn and what's being said here is almost symbolizing what Daniel was talking about, that there was a person who kind of symbolized what this end time person is going to represent, as far as his hatred towards God, towards people in general. And this person that he's talking about here, a lot of people believe that it's Antiochus Epiphanes. And if you look up Antiochus Epiphanes in history, he did a lot of terrible things, and specifically to the Jews. But one of the things that he did in here, that's talking about profaning the temple, profaning the holy, is that Antiochus Epiphanes, he went into the temple, into the holy place, and took a pig and cut its throat and smeared pig's blood all over the holy place in the temple. So, he had a disdain for the Jews in general, but also to the God that the Jews prayed for, or prayed to. So this is kind of a type, a kind of a visionary allusion to the future Antichrist. But this guy will be even worse than this one. And if you read about this guy, he's awful. Really, really awful. But there's some other things here that say that, possibly this could be a double predictive prophecy. Is that as he's doing this, he says the transgression that makes desolate. Now we talked about the abomination that causes desolation. There are some people, Jesus talked about that. Remember we talked about it last week, where Jesus named Daniel specifically in Matthew chapter 24. There are some commentators or interpreters who believe that, what we interpret as being the future Antichrist, they believe that the whole thing is just talking about Antiochus Epiphanes. But I think when you do that, you're ignoring all of the future part of this, all of the supernatural part of this that comes with the prophetic message. So, they can make some valid arguments, but I just don't think they stand up to scrutiny when you look at the whole thing. But he says here in verse 14, he said to me, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. Now, the 2,300 evenings, I think that's it's almost 7 years. Now, some commentators have said that this is relating to the time, not the entire time that Antiochus Epiphanes ruled, but the time that he did all of this desecration. what he did to the temple, what he did to the people. Like when he started that rampage till the time that he ended. Now as far as what history tells us, he died from a very horrible disease. And so, that could have been God striking him down, with his judgment. But and what makes me think that this is that Daniel is using Jewish days here is because he says 23 evenings and mornings. Now, if you go back and look in Genesis, where it talks about the beginning of as God's creating things each day, he says evening and morning. It's never morning and evening. That's what we do. But to them, a day started in the evening. It went evening to evening. That was how they did their days, or that was how they counted days. So it seems like Daniel is using the Jewish form of this, but I still think it comes out to just under 7 years. And a Jewish month is 300, or a Jewish month is 30 days. So a Jewish year would be 360 days, which they work it out with a system where they add a month after a certain number of years to make up for that missing time. So they got it figured out. They had it figured out back then. It's really hard to explain how they figured it out. It's kind of like how they did the same thing that we do with leap year. We have a 365-day year, but it's a little bit longer. So they have to add a day every 4 years to make up for it, so that way we don't lose time. So the Jews did the same thing by adding a month in there somewhere. It took a little time, but so anyway. So he gets the interpretation. We've already talked about that. Look down to verse 23. Now this is talking about this king. He said, "And at the latter end of their kingdom, when the transgressions have reached their limit, a king of bold face, one who understands riddles, shall arise. His power shall be great, but not by his own power. And he shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does, and destroy mighty men and the people who are the saints. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he shall become great. Without warning he shall destroy many, and he shall even rise up against the prince of princes, and he shall be broken, but by no human hand. The vision of the evenings and mornings that has been told is true." He said, "But seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now." He says, "And I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for many days. Then I rose and went about the king's business, but I was appalled by the vision and did not understand it." So even Daniel, who saw the vision, looked at the vision, got the interpretation, it says that he still didn't understand it. Now, folks, I don't know about you, but generally when you see something firsthand, it's a little bit easier to understand, isn't it? Now, if he didn't understand it and he was there, how do we think we're going to completely understand it?
Faith.
We might have faith, but that don't mean we're going to completely understand it. But we will have faith that God's going to work
One day
out.
we will.
One day we will. One day it's all going to work out. Now we know that part. That's a fact. We know it's going to work out. We may not know all the ways that it's going to work out and all the roads it's going to take to get there. But we just know it's going to work out. And that's the main thing. Now chapter 9 is a very intriguing chapter. In the first 19 verses of chapter 9, Daniel prays a prayer. Now, he skips ahead, so Remember, his last vision took place in the 3rd year of Belshazzar. Now, he's saying that in the 1st year of Darius. Now, Darius was who we left off with last week. He was the king that had been put in place. He was not the actual king. He was one that was just put over to reign at that time. Actually, this is not the same one. This is a different one. So this is later on down the road, way down the road. Now, and it says in the 1st year, here's when these visions took place over a long period of time. He said, in the 1st year of his reign, I, Daniel, perceived in the books the number of years that, according to the word of the Lord to Jeremiah the prophet, must pass before the end of the desolations of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. So, remember, Daniel, he had the prophecies that had been given that for 70 years, the Jewish people under captivity would be released after 70 years. So it's bound to be getting close to that time. Now, we know that under Persian rule, we know that there were attempts made to let them go home. And we know that there were. Remember when we studied Ezra and Nehemiah? That took place during that time frame, because under that king, that was when these things happened. And so Daniel says he recognized that, and he says he turned his face to the Lord, and he sought him in prayer and pleas for mercy with fasting and sackcloth and ashes. Now he goes on, and I'm not going to read all this, but he goes on and he talks about how he made confession. And one of the things that he goes back to is talking about making confession is that they had turned their back, they had not done what they were supposed to do, they had not listened to him, that they had walked away from the Lord. And he talks about, let's see here. He talks about how that they had, let me find it. All right, let's start at verse 11. He said, all Israel has transgressed your law and turned aside, refusing to obey your voice, and the curse and oath that are written in the law of Moses, the servant of God, have been poured out upon us because we have sinned against him. He has confirmed his words which he spoke against us and against our rulers who ruled us, by bringing upon us a great calamity. For under the whole heaven there has not been done anything like what has been done against Jerusalem. As it is written in the law of Moses, all this calamity has come upon us, yet we have not entreated the favor of the Lord our God, turning from our iniquities and gaining insight by your truth. Now, what he's talking about there, talking about breaking the laws of Moses, if you remember back in Deuteronomy, in the book of Deuteronomy, it talks about curses and blessings. Now, there's a long section that talks about curses and blessings in Deuteronomy. Now, God had said that if Israel would obey the laws that he had given to Moses, and that were recorded and repeated in front of the people, they knew the law. He said, if you would simply keep these laws, walk in my will and my way, I will bless you for many generations. He said, however, if you do not follow my will and my way, you will be succumbed to curse. And he talked about that they would be led by other nations, that they would be ruled by other people. And he talked about all these things, and that is what Daniel is recognizing. That's what Daniel is confessing in his prayer, that they have broken that covenant, that Mosaic covenant of following God's will and way. And he's pleading for mercy because he knows that the appointed time for them to be in captivity is at an end. And so this is a wonderful prayer. And this is one of those things where, we talk about individual prayer as people. We pray privately. But here's one of those things, if you go and look at the different examples in Jewish history, Jewish literature, there was a lot of corporate prayer. There was singular prayer, but there was a lot of corporate prayer where they prayed, like Daniel in here is saying, that we have failed to keep this. Now, as far as we know, Daniel didn't fail. We know that Daniel was faithful to God's word, faithful to his will and his way. We know that he listened to God. We don't have any example of Daniel not following the Mosaic law. But he's praying corporately that we have failed you as a people. And that you told us what was going to happen, and now we are feeling that curse that you said we would get. So he's just simply confessing that. Now, it says here that he gets a message from somebody else. Verse 20, so while I was speaking and praying, confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, and presenting my plea before the Lord my God for the holy hill of God, while I was speaking in prayer, the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision at the first. All right, so now we know, because Daniel didn't tell us previously. So in chapter 7, when Daniel said he saw this vision, and then he asked one who was standing there what it was, now we know who it was. Daniel tells us it was Gabriel who he was talking to. So while I was speaking in prayer, the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision at the first, came to me in swift flight at the time of the evening sacrifice. He made me understand, speaking with me and saying, O Daniel, I have now come out to give you insight and understanding. At the beginning of your pleas for mercy, a word went out, and I have come to tell it to you, for you are greatly loved. Therefore, consider the word and understand the vision. Now, here comes a part that is contentious. It's getting a lot of... It's been given a whole lot of criticism. And it's this part of chapter 9, and it's the 70 weeks of Daniel. So let's read it first, and then we'll kind of go through it a little bit. It says, 70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city, to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, and to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place. Know, therefore, and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem, to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks. Then for 62 weeks it shall be built, again with squares and a moat, but in a troubled time. And after the 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off, and shall have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war. Desolations are decreed, and he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week. And for half of the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering, and on the wing of abominations shall come one who makes desolate, until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. Alright, so there's a lot there. There's time involved, there's decrees involved, there's talking about a prince who's going to be anointed, there's a sanctuary, there's some other things that happen there, there's war, different desolations. There's covenants made, there's covenants broken, there's abominations made, and it goes back again, it says, on that wing of abominations comes the one who makes desolate. Now, there are people who think that this right here, that this was fulfilled with Antiochus Epiphanes, who lived during the, I think, 160s BC. Now, I just want to say this, just for clarification, that at the beginning of this, verse 24, I want to read it again so you'll hear it. And so you'll know and be able to say, all right, is this fulfilled or not in that person? Or is there something else yet to come? In verse 24, he says, 70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city to finish the transgression, to put to an end sin, and to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place. Now, has there been an end to sin yet? No. Has everlasting righteousness been brought into play? No. These things have not happened. So simple old me, I tend to take that and say that that does not apply to Antiochus Epiphanes. Yes, he did go into the temple. He did make war with the saints. He hated the Jews. He hated God. He desecrated the temple. He desecrated the holy place. But sin was not put to an end. Everlasting righteousness had not come. So he did not fulfill this prophecy. Not in its fullness. Now, like I said, maybe he was a type of what was to come to give us an idea of what would happen at some point. But let's talk about the 70 weeks. Now here, I don't know why the English does this, but it's talking about years, not weeks. It's how they interpreted the Hebrew. Now, this is a case where the King James Version actually got it more accurate than the other versions. And with the King James Version, it says sevens. Now, that term in Hebrew, sevens, means a set of sevens. And so in this case, it is a set of 7 years. All right? So when we look at that, these 77s, all right, it talks about these 70 sets of 7 years, which if you work out the math, is 490 years. All right, now, when you're talking about Daniel's 70th week, here it only talks about 69 weeks, or 483 years. So there's one set of 7 left to be complete. All right, so I'm going to run through a lot of math. Just bear with me. I'm trying to think about the guy. I can't remember his name. It might come to me in a moment. I may even have it wrote down here. But in what this is talking to, a guy went through and tried to figure this out, and I think it's pretty remarkable what he come up with. So that's what I'm going to try and convey. Now, the first thing to do, see, I had a chart to put up here. That's what I was looking for. I had a chart of this, and I can't find it on PowerPoint, so I don't know how to deal with it. So I got to try and find it, because it would have been really helpful right now. But when we look at, you kind of need to go back to Genesis chapter 7 and chapter 8, because it talks about a Jewish month. And in Genesis chapter 7, verse 11 and verse 24, it says, in the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 7th day of the 2nd month, on that day all the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened. the waters flooded the earth for 150 days. Then in Genesis 8, chapter 3 and 4, it said the water receded steadily from the earth. At the end of the 150 days, the water had gone down. And on the seventh day of the seventh month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. All right, so the seventh day of the second month in Genesis 7:11, and the seventh day of the seventh month in Genesis 8:4, that's 5 months. All right, so that would mean that was 150 days. All right, so if you do a little math there, that breaks down to 30-day months. All right, just like I said a while ago, the Jewish month is 30 days. All right, so when we look at the terms of, we've already seen that times, and half a time. All right, that is referring to 3.5 years. All right, so when we look at that, there's 3.5 years that we look at, there's 42 months that we look at, and there's 1,260 days that are all mentioned. Now, those days don't work on our calendar because we don't go by a Jewish calendar. All right, so you have to use a Jewish calendar in order to work this out. Now, going back to Daniel chapter 9, in verse 24, to understand when this takes place, he said, 77s are decreed for your people in your holy city to finish transgression, put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Alright, so this is pointing, in case you didn't figure it out, this is pointing to Christ. Alright? This is pointing to later times, pointing to Christ. I've already told you that this is talking about 490 years. Alright, so how does this work out in 490 years? The 490 years is the length of the prophecy from one end to the other. Now, here's what we know. He said in verse 25, chapter 9, he said, "Know and understand this, from the issuing of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the Anointed One, the ruler, comes, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. It will be rebuilt with streets in a trench, but in times of trouble." Okay, so the first clue here is the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. All right? There were 4 decrees that were given. Now, we've already talked about some of those in other books that we have studied, but we didn't talk about this part of it. The first was given by King Cyrus to rebuild the temple. You can find that in 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verses 22 to 23. We also find that in the book of Ezra, chapter 4, verses 1 through 4. All right. The second decree was given in the book of Ezra, chapter 6, verses 6 through 12. Now, this decree was given by King Darius. The third decree was given also in Ezra, chapter 7, verses 11 through 13. And this was given by King Artaxerxes. Now, all of these decrees were given to rebuild the temple. Here in Daniel, it says that the start of the prophecy it says, in verse 25, "Know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of the Anointed One." So Not the temple, not the decree to rebuild the temple, but to rebuild the walls and Jerusalem. All right? So far, there's 3 decrees that's been given, but they've all been to rebuild the temple. Now, here's where the 4th decree comes into play and the prophecy begins. The 4th decree was given by King Artaxerxes, and this was in Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 1 through 6. Now, in this decree, let's read that one. If you don't want to turn to Nehemiah, that's fine, or you can just write it down. I'll read it. You can read it later, or you can just make a note of it. But it says, in Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 1 through 6, it says, in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before, so the king asked me, why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart. I was very much afraid, but I said to the king, may the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my fathers are buried lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire? The king said to me, what is it you want? Then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my fathers are buried, so that I can rebuild it. Then the king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked me, how long will your journey take, and when will you get back? It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. All right, so that 4th decree is actually when the prophecy begins. All right, so we now know when that decree was given. So Artaxerxes, in the month of Nisan, in his 20th year of his reign, gave the decree to rebuild Jerusalem. All right, so he took power in 465 BC, so that would make the date of the decree 445 BC. All right, so that is the starting point of the prophecy, 445 BC. Now, we look at the next clue, all right, and that's in verses 25 to 26 of Daniel chapter 9. It says, after the 7 sevens and 62 sevens, the anointed one will be cut off and have no one. All right, so we know who the anointed one is. All right, and we have an idea of what cut off means and have no one. In case you don't know, wasn't he cut off? And wasn't he left by himself? The New Testament says that all the disciples deserted him. He was crucified. All right, so we have that clue that there would be after the 7 sevens and 62 sevens, the anointed one would be cut off. All right, so what we have now is we have 69 sevens, which equals out to 483 years. That's 69 sevens. 483 years. Now, if you do the math, which I did not do, somebody else did it, but I went back and checked it to see if it was right. Now, if you remember you have to do this according to Jewish days of the month. So you have 30 days in a Jewish month. So if you take 30 days in a month and you multiply that by 12 months in a year, that equals out to 360 days in a year. Now, if you multiply that by 483 years times 360 days in a year, that equals out to 173,880 days. That's a lot of days. It's a lot of time to look forward. Now, here's the guy's name, Sir Robert Anderson. He was the one who put all this math together. He did a fantastic job. So here's what he figured out. He figured out the exact dates of when all this took place. March 14th, 445 BC. That was when the decree was given. That's when the prophecy started. Now, if you add 483 years, 173,880 days is what the 483 years is. Now, do you know exactly, can you kind of take a gander of what date this kind of comes out to? When was Jesus crucified? Well, when do we celebrate the crucifixion and the resurrection? In Easter.
That's different dates.
It's different dates. But there was a specific date when, on that specific year when Jesus died, when he was crucified. So if you add the 483 years, it actually works out to the time when Jesus was crucified, which would match what is said here in Daniel, the 69 sevens, or the 483 years, works out from the time of the decree to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem to the time that Jesus was crucified. That's the math. That's how it works out. Now, I think the guy took a lot of time trying to figure that out. And he did take into account the adding of, because obviously every 483 years, obviously a month would have been added in to account for, the shortening of the year. So he took into account all that as well. And so it worked out, his math worked out to the time that Jesus, the year and the month that Jesus was crucified, from the time that decree was given. So there is your prophecy that is given in Daniel. Now, the prophecy says that 77s are decreed. All right, so like I said at the beginning, there are certain things that have not taken place. So when we talk about Daniel's 70th week, so far we haven't seen that 70th week, and here's some reasons why. To finish transgression. All right, hasn't happened. Put an end to sin. That hasn't happened. Atone for wickedness. All of these kind of go together, but it hasn't happened. Bring in everlasting righteousness. That hasn't happened. Seal up prophecy and vision. That hasn't happened. And to anoint the most holy. That hasn't happened. So there's a lot of things here that haven't happened yet. So he called for 77s, but we ain't made it there yet. There's 1 7 left to take place. So what does that amount to? Well, doesn't he talk about a 7-year span? Yes, he does. So in verse 27 of Daniel chapter 9, he says, he will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. So that's 7 years. In the middle of that 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering, and on a wing of the temple, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. So he makes a covenant for 1 7, but in the midst of that, he breaks that covenant. And that's talking about the tribulation.
Antichrist.
And the Antichrist. So that last week.
That's the first 3.5 years.
Yes. So that first 3.5 years. Now, it's not happened yet. The Antichrist hasn't come on the scene yet. The end of sin hasn't happened yet. So those things are yet to take place. But all the other stuff that was mentioned, it's taken place. So we're just waiting for that final week to transpire. When that happens, all the other stuff, put an end to sin, all that's going to take place.
What about what I said about the God and God war? Is it gonna come, it's gonna come before the tribulations?
What did we talk about that?
I mean, it's building up right now. You can see it and feel it.
Yeah, but again, that's one of those things we don't know. We don't know who that's talking about because every
We're talking about China, Russia, and Turkey, Syria.
Yeah, but every century, you think about it. You think about when the Bible was written, and think about who was in power at any certain century. Russia wasn't a world power. Actually, Russia's already fell and crumbled one time, the former USSR. So, there were people during that time saying that, well, Russia's going to be the one. Well, Russia fell. So I mean, there's been different powers. There were people who were saying that it was Germany, Nazi Germany. There's been all these different.
Well, Germany's an ally. It's
So-
one of our allies.
But what I'm saying is that at one time Germany was.
Sure. Yeah.
So it just depends on what time frame you're in is how people interpret that. So, that's one of those things where I was talking about, where we need to be careful, not really worry about so much who the players are, because we don't know, because, players.
I mean, that's
change.
prophecy. It's going to take place before the rapture.
I mean, we know that there's going to be a lot of things that happen. There's going to be a lot of things that happen during the tribulation. Now, whether there's a rapture before or after,
Well, like you say,
I don't know.
main thing is be ready.
Being ready. And that's always the important thing, and that's,
And spread the gospel.
yeah, and that's our job. As we look forward, as Christians, we look forward to this time when it comes to an end. Because we're looking forward to an end of sin. Because, we ourselves, even though we're Christians, we're still troubled with sin. It still burdens us. I'm looking forward to a time when I'm no longer burdened.
I'm looking forward to a time when there's no Democrats or Republicans. It's nothing but Jesus.
And I can say a big hearty amen to that. But we know that there are things yet to transpire. But we know that there are things that we're looking forward to. And, I don't want to discount prophecy, but I don't want to, there's some people, they spend all of their time focused on trying to figure out who this is or when this is or this, that, and the other. I mean, those things, they're kind of fun to study. But being prepared, being strong in your faith, because the Bible does tell us that there's going to be a lot of people fooled. And there's a lot of people who think they're Christians who are going to be fooled. And what comes to mind is how, I think, kind of a glimpse of what we've seen is how many Christians, or people who say they're Christians, believe what the government tells them.
Right. Well, Scripture says is the path is wide.
Yeah.
What is it? The path.
The path
The
is wide.
path is wide, but
The way to find it is
the
narrow.
way
and
is
few.
narrow.
Yeah. So, I mean, just, seeing how easily people have, how easily people have made the government or an agency their idol. That's who they worship. That's who they put their faith and trust in. I mean, from what I'm seeing right now, there's going to be a lot of people that are gonna be fooled and they ain't gonna make it. And that's where Jesus' message comes in about being prepared, about being ready. And, you know, if you remember as we went through the parables of Jesus, that was always the point of Jesus' message. It wasn't about when he was coming, because he always said the point of his message was, I'm coming when you least expect it. I'm coming like a thief in the night. You're not going to know when I come. And his message was to be ready in case I do come. And that, you know, as Christians, we have this responsibility that until these things take place, we have a responsibility to share the gospel, not only in church, but also outside the church. So, I mean, I love studying this. I like looking at the math. I think it's pretty neat. But the main thing is to be ready. To know that you're ready to meet your Savior. If there isn't a rapture before the tribulation, or even if there is, we still need to be ready regardless. That's the main thing. I think if we focus on that, I was talking, you know, Bill, I talk to him a lot, and we talk about this a lot too. And I said, you know, we can talk about the different methods of interpretation as far as the rapture goes, or the tribulation, or the millennium. We can talk about all that stuff. And it's fun, it's good study, it helps us grow. So, but the main thing is we need to have the fundamentals about Jesus. He was born of a virgin, that he lived, that he died for our sins, that he rose again, and that he's coming back. You know, those things, those are the fundamentals. You've got to have the fundamentals before everything else. Because if you don't have the fundamentals, those other things don't mean much. And as I call them, they're just trivial matters. They're not salvation matters. But those foundational things, those are salvation matters.
And everything it boils down to one thing. It's a choice between accepting him and denying him.
That's it. That's exactly right. Yep. Now, the other stuff that we learn in the Bible is not meaningless. It's just not salvation issues. You know, whether I agree that the rapture will take place before the tribulation, or whether somebody else agrees that it will take place after tribulation, that's not a salvation issue. But it's like Ronnie said, either accepting Christ as your Lord and Savior, or either denying him. That's all that matters. That's the main thing. If we focus on that, everything else is gravy, as they say.
Living right here.
Well, that's it for today. I hope I didn't bore you to death with numbers. I just thought it was pretty neat that somebody had the time to work that out. But you'll know now that when you go and you read that in Nehemiah, you'll know that was the decree that started Daniel's 70th week, that prophecy. Now you know. Anybody got any additional comments?
The black people, they talk about how they was persecuted and all this, and the Native Americans, Indians, they were pretty bad too. But the Jewish people, they were the most persecuted people in the world for a long, long time.
Yep. Christians persecuting people now.
Yeah, well, it's gonna get worse.
Yep. It absolutely is, and I mean, it's getting worse right here at home.
Yeah, it's gonna get to the point that we'll have to go, Christians will have to go underground.
Yep. Well, any other comments? Any other comments?